And one day, I predict a great future in politics itself for Jackson Hinkle. Jackson, welcome back. Let's start with you, if we may, because you're on Twitter now, but there was a time when you were put off Twitter, and then you were on YouTube and you built up a gigantic platform, and they've now kicked you off. What exactly did you do wrong?
I wish I knew. All I got to say is a big thank you to voices like you and Jimmy Dore, who've been having me on their shows to talk about this, because it's really incredible. It's the same old thing. If YouTube was around and is prevalent, during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, we all know they would have taken you off of YouTube immediately because you were telling the truth. And you've continued telling the truth this entire time, and I appreciate you having me on today. YouTube didn't tell me why they took me down, but I'd imagine because they didn't even cite a single video, they didn't tell me I violated their community guidelines in a video, anything like that. I'd imagine it has to do with the fact that, as you said, we were getting the truth out to so many people, 300,000 subscribers, about 10 million, 12 million views every single month, to people all across the world about the war in Ukraine. And I would have loved to talk about the war in Gaza and what's going on there, but I was banned before that even took place. Fortunately, I've been covering that on X or Twitter, and I've gained about 300,000 new followers there over the past few days. So that's really good, and I'll be uploading my content on Rumble very soon.
Well, let's make sure everybody follows you on X, on Twitter. 300,000 of a jump in a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, is sensational news. But if there's anyone watching this who has not yet followed Jackson Hinkle on Twitter, on X, you really must do so now, because this young man speaks with a clarity and an authenticity. He's not some hairy Black Lives Matter shop front burner, glass breaker in Minnesota. He's a clean-cut, all-American boy. He's an American patriot who actually genuinely believes in America first and wants a government in America that will put America first. Now, on that, Jackson, it seemed like we had a lot of allies over the last 12 months, 18 months or so, of free speech absolutists, America firsters, Trumpers, MAGA people, until the Israeli assault on Gaza began. Then we discovered that actually they're Israel firsters. How did that happen?
I wish I knew, because if I knew, I'd be able to maybe put a dent in correcting the situation and trying to, dissuade the people who are being propagandized on this subject. But it's so disheartening. All these people who were laughing at the Ukraine propaganda and about how Joe Biden was toying with the idea about sending us to World War III for the past 1 year and 8 months, now within days have fallen hook, line, and sinker for every single insane lie that's been put forward about what's going on in Gaza right now. And, we don't even have to get into details. Everyone knows. You can look at Twitter and even go to Israel's own official X account and see the lies that they're being corrected on by community notes right now. They're being fact-checked in real time. So for the American right, and you mentioned also the British right, and I'm sure many of the conservative movements in Europe, to just go along with all of these lies and immediately shift from the focus of protecting our own borders, say in America, to going off about protecting, Israeli borders. It's really disheartening, and it shows that these people are not principled when it comes to anti-imperialism or when it comes to opposing this American unipolar world order. They simply have other interests that I guess are primary in their stake about how the world should operate.
Let's look at what it might be. You and I are both religious believers, followers of Jesus. Did these people not see the Christian Palestinian nuns singing Ave Maria in their church in Gaza and declaring that they would not be evacuating anywhere, that they would die there in their church. Do the evangelicals, the so-called Christian right, the born again amongst the American right wing, do they know that Jesus was a Palestinian, that the first Christians walked in Palestine? Do they know that something like 15% of all Palestinians in the world are Christians? So if they know that, how come they are so gung-ho for the slaughter of their own co-religionists?
Again, great question. They also probably don't know that, Palestinians technically are Semites. So for them to call all Palestinians anti-Semitic, I always find funny. But one other thing that I think should be addressed is, as I'm sure you've been discussing, it seems as though Israel is really hell-bent on expanding this conflict into a broader Arab conflict. And I think there's some very foolish, naive, egotistical maniacs within the Israeli government that somehow think this is going to be another 6-day war for them and they're going to walk out with an easy victory. It's not going to be the case. But let's take a look at that. You brought up the question of Christians and Christianity in this region and what's being done to them. Well, Israel right now is bombing two of the oldest cities in the world, Aleppo and Damascus. And in the Syrian dirty war, which lasted for the past 10 or so years, guess who Israel supported? Israel supported al-Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda adjacent group, which wanted to massacre Christians in Syria. So you got to ask the question, why on earth, if you're a Christian, I'm an Orthodox Christian, why on earth would you be supporting the government that was waging a proxy war to eradicate Christians in Syria? It makes no sense to me whatsoever, but I think a lot of these people are just historically illiterate.
Do you think race lies at the bottom of it? I mean, I'm searching, like you are, for an explanation for the volte-face of the free speech absolutists, the America firstists. Is it because they just don't like Arabs? They just don't like Arab Christians or Arab Muslims? They don't like the other? Is it because the Palestinians are othered comprehensively?
I think a lot of it could come down to that. Ben Shapiro is not a Christian. He's Jewish, but I shared a very provocative tweet of his yesterday, and I got a lot of views and clicks because everyone was just so shocked that he could say something like this. I think, to paraphrase, he said, the simple fact of the matter is Israelis like to build things and Arabs like to bomb things, and that's why we can't have peace with them. So when you get down to the nitty gritty, if this is what, and I'm not saying this is what they all, everyone who's diehard Israel supporter right now believes, but if there's a good chunk of them that supports that sort of a mindset, then yeah, that would be just blatant, egregious racism. Unfortunately, this racism is charged with a nuclear-armed military and intelligence superpower that could do a lot of damage to themselves and to continue to do to the Palestinians, the Syrians. They could potentially even invite a broader war with Iran or Turkey. Who knows what's going to happen here? It's very frightening these days, and we see it continuing to escalate, and there's really no calls for peace.
No, in fact, it's become, I think the press secretary at the White House said that calling for a ceasefire was repulsive. That was the word that she used, that it was repugnant or repulsive to demand a ceasefire. You're so young you never knew it, but there was a time that in any conflict, the foreign statespeople and the UN Secretary General, their first thing that they would do would be to call for a ceasefire. It's now practically an arrestable offense to call for a ceasefire. I've no idea how that happened, Jackson.
I think we got a lot of, again, historically illiterate individuals that now occupy these positions in the State Department. And they also are just extremely egotistical and think that America can do no wrong. Compare that to someone like Vladimir Putin, who has already called for the implementation of the United Nations Security Council resolution for the creation, the establishment once more of a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. He also has called for an immediate ceasefire. So, there still are leaders like that in the world, they're just not in the West.
Well, the demarcation lines are eerily familiar. Everyone that was gung-ho for Zelensky is gung-ho for Netanyahu. And everyone that was saying this is a NATO proxy war against Russia is standing beside the Palestinians. This is the new world that we're in, isn't it?
It is. I think the one saving grace that we might be able to look at here is on the first day of the Russian special military operation, very few and far between were there any voices, and I was one of them, but were there any voices that were supporting Russia or maybe calling into question the notion that Russia is the supreme evil and the reincarnation of Nazi Germany? With this subject, with this conflict, obviously it's one that isn't new for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot more people who are sympathetic to the overall struggle of Palestinian statehood and the end of war crimes being committed against the Palestinian people than we saw for supporters at the start of the SMO for Russia. So I think that's one saving grace. The question is, can we convince people of the truth and reality who are so brainwashed, so propagandized, and have been for so long about this conflict with Israel and Palestine?
And here we must make a special mention of the Jewish people around the world, in Israel itself, in the United States, people like your friend and mine, Max Blumenthal, may God preserve him, Norman Finkelstein, and so many, many, many others. Cohen, who was on our show on Wednesday, Dan Cohen, and in Britain also, indeed around the world, Katie Halper, some of the most magnificent people in the world today are Jewish people, and we should never forget that.
Yeah, I think I always recommend to people, if you want to have the best coverage about what has gone on in Palestine for years and years and years, and the broader Middle East, Max Blumenthal, The Gray Zone, Dan Cohen over at Redacted, those are the best sources you really, I think, as an English speaker, are probably going to be getting. And you're 100% correct about that. There are tons of anti-Zionist Jewish people who have spoken out over the past few days. And I have to applaud them for that, especially starting today, because it seems as though Benjamin Netanyahu has taken a page out of the book of Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. Israel just passed a new law moments before I came on the show today, saying that anyone in Israel who is consuming prolonged periods of content of what they define as Hamas media will now face imprisonment for up to a year. And as we all know, you can't really prove something like that, whether or not someone is consuming Hamas media. I think it's going to be used as a blanket offense that they are going to utilize to target anyone who speaks out against this potential war that the IDF might be foolish enough to actually launch.
I mean, you talked a couple of times already about historical illiteracy. Nothing could be more redolent of the crimes of the recent historical past. Recent for me, I was born 9 years after the Red Army liberated Auschwitz. Winston Churchill was still the Prime Minister in Britain when I was born. We actually grew up, people like me, in a period when the supporters of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army, and the huge bank of progressive leftist Jewish people were absolute ironclad allies. And now it's all so different. As you say, Russia is described as the Nazis. And the people who were the victims of the Nazi filth in the 1930s and 40s are passing fascist laws to stop their people reading. It's book burning, that.
It really is. It really is. And it's so sad also, because if you look at Putin today, I mean, he's simply just calling for peace. And, you know, he's a guy that obviously grew up, worked in intelligence in the Soviet Union, the latter years. But he is someone who's had a very longstanding good relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. And he's being painted, even in this very conflict, take aside the whole SMO in Ukraine, he's being painted in this conflict as a terrorist, because he's saying that, you know, we need to implement the United Nations Security Council resolution on the establishment of a Palestinian state, and he's calling for a ceasefire. It's the same thing with Ukraine. If you call for peace in Ukraine, you're labeled as a Putin apologist. If you call for peace here, you're labeled as a Hamas apologist. And regardless of what your views are, I frankly don't care what anyone's views are, but I think everyone should be agreeing that at the end of the day, what we need to push for is peace here. We need to stop the slaughtering of civilians. One last thing I'll say on this subject is, according to the United Nations official stats, which make of those what you will, they've recorded 560 children civilian deaths in the entire Ukraine war over the past 1 year and 8 months. Now, compare that number, 560 children that have been killed in Ukraine over the past 1 year and 8 months, to the 700 children that have been killed in Gaza over the past 6 days by the Israelis. I mean, if you needed any stat to show that Putin and his men have really acted like saints in this operation compared to what Israel's doing, that's it right there.
Well, we stand on the cusp, and the Israeli army stands at the gates. I don't know if you heard my opening remarks, but I'm saying it's not because of bad weather that they have not yet gone in. It's because there are geopolitical wheels in motion, because others, if not Netanyahu, are able to calibrate the potential scale of first a regional war, and one that could even become far wider even than the Middle East, West Asian region. What's your take on it? Are they going to go in? What might be holding them back?
I think, like you said, the geopolitical interests and balances that are at play definitely are a factor in what appeared to be a bluff that was called. You know, they said they were going to launch the ground operation last night, and then they didn't, and they cited poor weather. And I saw a few videos, I guess, of heavy rains or flooding in Tel Aviv, but on the border of Gaza, I saw plenty of photos and videos today and yesterday, which looked like very, very dry, hot, sunny weather. So they're not invading Tel Aviv, they're invading Gaza in this operation. So I don't know what they're talking about, heavy rains. As for other reasons, I really do believe that with Hamas, you're talking about a group that has prepared its defensive lines and positions in Gaza for at least probably a year. They've been planning this. They have been acting as sleuths. They've been acting under the cover of any sort of intelligence seeking or gathering operations by the Israelis. And I guess you could maybe make the case that maybe Israel, knew about this and that they actually wanted a full-blown war, but we don't know that for certain. And the other thing is, the Hamas fighters, I mean, they've basically got a sniper's heaven that's been created for them by the incessant bombing by the IDF. So if I was an IDF soldier, and I know some IDF reservists just from, having friends in college, and these kids, they get Israeli citizenship and then they go and do training in Israel for maybe a summer or a year, something to that effect. They're not really doing anything. They get training, limited training. They get set up at a guard post. Maybe they fire a few shells from some sort of gun or artillery or whatever. And they don't really know anything about war. They're not prepared. The IDF hasn't had real battleground experience since 2008. So you're telling me that these 300,000 TikTok Zoomer reservists that the IDF has called up are actually going to pose some sort of a serious threat to Hamas in this sniper's heaven, where there's going to be booby traps, mines, drones, anywhere and everywhere that they could imagine? Maybe, but also we know for certain that it's going to be very bloody for the IDF as well. It's not something that I would want to be in the shoes of marching into Gaza right now. That's probably the last place on earth I'd want to be.
Jackson Hinkle, everyone follow him. Thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Much obliged to you.